When looking back at early video game history, Atari's Pong, released back in 1972, is considered the beginning of video games. But the truth is, there's at least 20 years of gaming history that predates Pong. In one of my previous videos, we took a look at Birdie the Brain, the world's first video game, which was invented in 1950. And in another video, we took a look at the entire 1950s in gaming. There were actually a lot of games that were invented back then that paved the way for the future of video games. Of course, this time period is long before the invention of home consoles and arcade systems, which means that the only types of games that were invented back then were on computers. And the same is true when we're talking about the 1960s, which is the decade that we'll be focusing on in this video. Like the 1950s, there is no commercial home computer market in the 60s, which means that you'd only really see a computer inside a research facility. And although we saw vast improvements in technology from the 50s to the 60s, we were still a long way before computers became accessible to the average person. For example, you had the PDP-1 mini computer, which was small enough to fit inside a person's home, not like those large mainframe computers that you saw in the 50s, so you think, oh, it could fit in someone's home, maybe computers become more accessible, except the PDP-1 cost over $120,000. And adjusted for inflation in 2020, that would be close to $1 million. So yeah, we definitely had a long way to go before computers became mainstream, because it was still way too expensive to get into. Despite this, you still had several games that were developed in the 1960s that are definitely worth discussing because they would set the foundation for the future of gaming. The game that had the most impact in the 1960s was definitely 1962 Space War, a two-player space combat game programmed for the PDP-1 computer that for a 60-year-old game had pretty impressive visuals, I would say. The game's lead designer, Steve Russell, actually wanted Space War to be one player versus an AI, but the technology just wasn't there. The game was already pushing the PDP-1 to its very technological limits, which forced the design of the game to be shifted to a two-player experience. The purpose of the game was pretty straightforward. One player had to destroy the other player's spaceship. At first, the game was controlled by the PDP-1 switchboard, but the controls were so clunky and uncomfortable that a gamepad was eventually developed in order to make the game a lot more comfortable to play. Space War was so popular in the research community that it was actually ported to other PDP-1 computers in various labs, including MIT and other research institutions. On the surface, this game doesn't really seem like much. It's a simple space combat game that is very primitive, but it actually ended up having a really significant impact on video game history, because Nolan Bushnell, founder of Atari, creator of Pong, was inspired by Space War to make his first game, Computer Space, which came out a year before Pong and was actually the first commercially available video game that jump-started the entire video game industry. And when you see the gameplay of Computer Space, you can easily see the inspiration that Space War had on its development. Space War is definitely one of those games that had such a huge impact on video game history, yet is so overlooked. I mean, how many of you watching this video right now even heard of Space War before? I'm sure most of you haven't. I'm sure most of you haven't even heard of Computer Space either. You thought Pong was the first game. And that's really what inspires me to make these videos on the early history of video games that nobody talks about. The 1950s, the 1960s, those were very important decades in gaming history, but almost nobody talks about it, which makes sense because it's not like those games were commercially available. The average person didn't have access to them, so the average person never heard of them, obviously. But still, I think the early era video games definitely deserves a lot more attention and appreciation, because those early games would lay the foundation for what would come later. And while Space War is definitely the most important game to look at from the 60s, there are other games that also would have a later impact in video game history. In 1968, Hammurabi was created, the world's first text-based strategy game, and in 1969 we got the world's first open-world exploration game called Space Travel. So the 1960s were definitely a very important time in video game history that deserves a lot more attention, and I hope you all enjoyed learning more about it. Thank you for watching.